So welcome everyone to this Thursday evening talk. Today we are welcoming Fr Ross. Fr Ross Crichton is a priest of the island of Eriskay in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, a poet and a translator of both Scottish Gaelic and Cornish. His current works include translating hymns into Gaelic and the Bible into Cornish. So Fr Ross, thank you for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. If we move to slide 1. It's a pleasure to be here at Oxford University. It's a first time for me, I'm ashamed to say, so I look forward to discovering the delights of the university and the town during this short visit. What I'm about to say will not earn me your favour, at least initially, but I hope to redeem myself in due course. My father's cousin, who is a vicar in the Scottish Episcopal Church, studied at Cambridge in the 1970s. He was resident in Westcott House, situated just across from Jesus College. And he told me a story that when he arrived in Cambridge, he was shown around by another student training for the ministry. And on reaching the laundry room, he was told that the machines were not working for the moment, and his mentor dryly informed him, "If you've any dirty washing, take it to Jesus." And thus his theological training began on a very practical note. Now, one summer when I returned from seminary in Rome, I met with my Uncle Kenneth, and he was very keen to compare notes about our respective formations in seminary. So I told him we would rise about 6 every morning, attend morning prayer or mass about 6:30 or 7. Then after a quick breakfast, we would set off for the Gregorian University, run of course by our good friends the Jesuits. And lectures began about 8:30, continuing to after midday when we had to endure an hour's journey home to the Scots College for lunch. Recreation then followed in the afternoon, evening prayer, supper, and then meetings before Magnum Silentium began from 10 p.m. onwards. Not that the Great Silence was very rigorously observed by the students. Uncle Kenneth frowned, saying it all sounded rather harsh. I asked him what his seminary formation had been like at Cambridge, and he described his day as follows: morning prayer and breakfast, followed by class. Then the students would gather for gins before lunch, and after lunch, a game of croquet on the lawn or punting on the cam, and then a relaxing evening before bed. And I knew in that instant I should have adopted for Anglicanism. One of our 17th century monarchs in Scotland was reputed to have said of Presbyterianism that it was not a religion for gentlemen. After speaking with Uncle Kenneth, I began to think that the same might be said of Catholicism, at least for us in the seminary system. However, enough of Cambridge. Let me redeem myself now by mentioning a more distant connection with Oxford as an inroad to my talk this evening. So if we move on to this is slide 2, sorry. So through a 3 times great-grandmother, I have roots in distant notes. Sorry, it's the one back the way. Yeah, that one there. I've got roots in distant Cornwall through a family surnamed Bray. And as we ascend that tree in the family, we come to a more distant ancestor who rejoiced in the name Ambrose Bray. Doesn't come any more West Country than that. His wife was an Anne Painter, and she was a cousin of William Painter from St Erth in Cornwall. And William was a student in Exeter College here in Oxford, rising to become its rector in 1690, and eventually vice-chancellor of the university until his death in 1716. Now I tell you this not for the purpose of demonstrating any meaningful link with Oxford University, but to demonstrate a rather Celtic obsession, a relationship with the people and the events of the past, and how it gives us a sense of connection to the present. And that leads me to the subject of this evening's gathering. As an island priest, genealogy is not simply a matter of interest, it's an essential tool for survival in an island community. In small rural communities, it's vital to know how people are related. This knowledge enables you to avoid inadvertently saying things about someone to a cousin who may relate the story back to the subject. But on the other hand, it also enables you to pass on messages to individuals without approaching them directly, knowing that if you tell the gossip-obsessed second cousin once removed, information will be relayed back to the person quicker than a WhatsApp message. In our community, people are often known by what's called their slonjog, the nearest concept in English being patronym, and that moves us on to slide 3. So a Donald McCaskill, as we see there, his civil name, might be known as Donald Alistair and Talia. Donald, son of John, son of John, son of Alexander, son of Duncan, the tailor. That would be his slonjog, his patronym. So Donald is known in relation to his great-great-grandfather, and therefore in relation to others who are descended from what we would call Clown and Talia, the children of the tailor, the descendants of the tailor. So in some way, his identity is defined in relation to his family history. In a world divided into anywheres and somewheres, the Celtic peoples are most certainly in the somewhere category. We feel a deep sense of connection with both people and place, and our identity is very much defined by what we've inherited from previous generations. So it's not an error that to ask someone in Gaelic where they are from, we actually ask who they are from, ko as a hashiv. The idea that we are tabula rasa in terms of our identity is foreign to the Celtic mindset. We have a sense of connection with generations past, and the language and songs and culture and places and faith that were important to them are also important to us. We know too that we are but mere links in a chain, that process of transmission doesn't end with us. We are not so important as to be its end point. It's only ours to possess so that we in turn can pass it on. And already I hope you're hearing echoes of what St. Paul said in the scriptures. I have received from the Lord that which I delivered unto you, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Move on to slide 4, please. So before I develop that theme further, let me take you on a little tour of the islands where I live. An island of which Father Alan MacDonald, my predecessor and a great Gaelic scholar, wrote in his diary, I long for a bright, pleasant summer's day when Eriskay is a terrestrial paradise, and I would not exchange it with anyone. And he wrote that in 1898. Yes, we all long for a pleasant summer's day in a Hebridean winter, let me assure you, and when it comes, it makes the place a terrestrial paradise. So despite its isolation, I tend to agree with Father Alan. Eriskay has the distinction of being the place where Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie as he's known to us, took his first steps in the land of his ancestors. The 23rd of July 1745 saw him come ashore in Traillish, which is the beach in this picture here, and a cairn marks the spot where his homecoming eventually led to the enforced exile of thousands of Gaels in the clearances that followed from the failure of the Stuart cause at Culloden. Ironically, Eriskay was one of the few places in Scotland that benefited from the clearances. Eriskay is a beautiful island with stunning scenery, but it's not a fertile place. Life in the Highlands depended on possessing the right type of land for crofting and cutting peat, and Eriskay has little of either. For that reason, its population was always low, right up until the 1840s. As the clearances progressed, people who were reluctant to immigrate were forced onto less fertile land in Scotland where it was hoped they would come to their senses and voluntarily make their way to the New World. Eriskay was one such place, and reluctant crofters cleared from their land in neighbouring Barra, South Uist and Hellisay found temporary refuge on Eriskay, and they made it their home. So the population went from 40 in about 1841 to over 400 in just those 10 years. The people turned from crofting to fishing and were able to eke out a living because of that. Sustained by their rich oral culture and their strong Catholic faith, they had the resilience to form a cohesive community and make Eriskay a permanent home. So this little island, 3 miles by 1, has remained a stronghold of the Gaelic language and the Catholic faith, which have marked every generation since that initial settlement. An unbroken chain taking us back to St. Columba, who brought the language and the faith to our shores. In modern-day Britain, Eriskay is a bit like that village des irréductibles Gaulois that we find in the Asterix books, a tiny community holding out against the powerful forces of the dominant cultural empire which encircles it. Of course, there are other such communities elsewhere in the Highlands and Islands and across the Celtic fringe. And I think there's an increasing movement towards embracing regional and minority identities all over Europe and the West as people seek a rootedness and a connection with an ancestral cultural, religious or linguistic heritage which they've lost through the generations. And in that movement is a seed of hope for the mission of the church. We'll move on to slide 5. I can ask somebody to close the door over, please. Just the sun is blinding me. I don't think there's anyone left in the room now. Oh, ça ne marche pas. Doesn't work. Perhaps. I'll just shift it round a wee bit. Hopefully that's better. That's better. So, confession time. I'm not a native of Eriskay, nor of the Hebrides. But on my mother's side of the family, I've got strong roots in the Highlands with family connections to some of the important figures in scholarship relating to the Gaelic language. So my maternal grandfather has roots in Lochaber in Inverness-shire, and through his mother was related to Charles Fraser Mackintosh, the MP that we see here. He was known as the Crofter MP, an advocate for the Gaelic language and for Gaelic education in the late 1800s. And on that same side of the family, we also find the Celtic scholar Reverend Thomas McLaughlin, who was moderator of the Free Church in 1886, and another Celtic scholar. Another more distant cousin was this chap here, Reverend Dr. George Henderson from Coltarlity, near Inverness, and he was minister in the Church of Scotland, but he was also the first full-time lecturer of Celtic at Glasgow University from 1906 to 1912 when he died. And you'll be pleased to learn that having completed his doctorate in Vienna, George Henderson studied Gaelic dialects for a B.Lit here at Oxford, resident in that great Celtic refuge, Jesus College, another little connection with this august establishment. So through the McLaughlins, we're also related to the Abreachan poet or bard Thomas MacDonald, or Thomas and Poet, as he was known. And then through my maternal grandmother, our family descends from the McCalls in Ardnamurchan, a remote peninsula in Scotland where the Gaelic language is still spoken. And that's a family which has produced many Gaelic bards down through the years, down through the generations. Glasgow is known to us in Gaelic as Ballamorn and Gael, the great city of the Gaels, because so many Highlanders made their homes there after the clearances. And I grew up just south of Glasgow, a descendant of these people, and very much aware of that cultural legacy that those family links have given to me. So what I have received, I feel that I in turn must pass on. St. Paul said those words in relation to the faith, of course. But a central mystery of our faith is the incarnation. The eternal Son of God took flesh. The spiritual took on our physical nature. And likewise, the Christian faith must be incarnate in whatever culture it finds itself. Let's be clear, though, what we mean by this. What enters into the essence of the faith cannot and must not be changed. All that is of divine origin in our faith, our creed, our sacraments, the Church's divine constitution, is not subject to change in the name of enculturation. That's a false understanding of enculturation. We can't lop articles from the creed, reduce the sacraments from 7 to 4, or abolish the office of bishop and still claim to be the Church founded by Christ. All that can change is the clothes that these things wear, the language in which our doctrines are expressed, the liturgies in which the sacraments are celebrated, the manner in which deacons, priests, and bishops exercise their functions within the Church. Any time the media comment on the Church, and I mentioned this at dinner with somebody as well, there was certainly plenty of evidence of it during the recent conclave too. The assumption is made that the Church needs to enculturate by altering its teachings to suit the fads of the modern age. We need to change our rules on accessing the sacraments or open up our governmental structures more widely. But those areas are not up for grabs. To borrow that Thomistic distinction of substance and accident, we can't alter the substance of the faith and still call it the Catholic faith. All we can alter are the accidents in which the substance is clothed and made accessible to us. A genuine richness of the Catholic faith is the diversity of cultures in which this universal faith expresses itself. We think of the variety of liturgical rites which exist within the Catholic Church, of which our Latin rite is but one of 24. And even within the Latin rite, we find a cultural diversity which enriches the Church and enables people in particular cultural environments to access the truths of the faith in a language they can understand. We must also remember, though, that the faith refines and elevates what is good in human cultures. It perfects those cultures. So in my context, the Gaelic language has been linked to the Christian faith since both arrived on our shores over 1,500 years ago. When St. Columba and his monks established their monastery in Scottish Dalriata, the Christian faith was already clothed in the Gaelic language and culture, and the two have become inextricably intertwined in the intervening centuries, like the warp and woof of a fine Harris tweed. Our culture is infused with Christianity, and the practice of our faith finds its fullest expression in the Gaelic language. So the two go together for us as body and soul, the faith being the soul which animates the language, and the language giving flesh to our faith. I don't know if there are any linguists among you. Any linguists? A couple, 3 or 4, very good. Well, here are a few examples of how Christianity has influenced the Gaelic language, and the same could be said of other Celtic languages too. Many words relating to education or ecclesiastical life have come into Gaelic from Latin, although looking at the Gaelic, it wouldn't be instantly obvious because they came in very early and have been moulded by that language over time. So we have the word Ecclis, ecclesia, church, Liawer in Gaelic, which comes from liber, the BH softening over time, book, Sagerst, sacerdos, priest. And then these 3 days of the week here, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, are not named after pagan gods. They're named after Christian fasts. So we have Jikiating, the day of the first fast, that's Wednesday. Jarduin at the bottom is the day between 2 fasts, Ji Etertauin, and Jehunya, the day of the great fast, referring to the fact that in the Celtic Church they fasted on a Wednesday and on a Friday. So these very common words show that we've enculturated the Christian faith by clothing it in Gaelic language, and we've kept those words from a long, long time ago. Living on an island, we are endowed with a false sense of security because everywhere we look, we see Catholicism and we hear the Gaelic language. We forget that our little village des Irréductibles Gaulois only occupies a rock in the Atlantic 3 miles long. We're very small on the world stage. Our situation is actually very fragile, and we have to work very hard to pass on what we have received. And that's one of my duties as a priest in that community. Aside from the administration and pastoral work of the 2 parishes I serve, I also have the additional task of translating liturgical texts into the vernacular for inclusion in a new prayer book that I'm compiling. I'm also in the process of compiling a new hymn book, which will bring together what we already have in Gaelic with new hymns which have been freshly translated or composed. And the guiding principle of my work in translating hymns has been that of the incarnation that I referred to earlier, bringing together the riches of the wider historical Christian tradition and then the bardic Gaelic tradition. There were gaps in the old Gaelic hymn book for certain liturgical seasons, particularly Lent and Easter. And my first task was to produce hymns to fill those gaps. But how to go about it? That was the question. Now, I've seen in English, and I'm sure you have too, in our modern liturgy sometimes, how awful new compositions can be. Sentimental ditties produced in a hurry, often with very bad theology, and so very difficult to sing with any conviction. So to avoid this problem and being accused of heresy, I decided not to write my own compositions, at least at first. I decided to take the ancient Latin hymns from the breviary and translate them into Gaelic using the traditional bardic meters from our classical poetic tradition. Now that's not an easy task, as you can imagine, but with bardic forebears in my family, I felt some sense of duty to rise to that challenge and keep that bardic light burning. Gaelic poetry, as we see here, operates to a very strict metrical system, which I'll demonstrate for you. As with English poetry, we have end rhyme, and you see that highlighted in red there. We call that cordach in Gaelic, this end rhyme that it can be A, B, A, B, or A all the way through, just as you have in English too. But it's important to bear in mind that it's only the vowels that matter in Gaelic, long vowels and short vowels. The consonants don't really matter at all. So Gaelic rhyme is based on similar vowel quality and length. The complexity of Gaelic poetry is evident when we consider the other 2 types of rhyme, which are known in English as internal rhyme. And I'll give 3 examples of those as you see on the screen. So first of all, we have cordach. We've got the end rhyme, which we're all familiar with. And using this extract by a Gaelic bard from South Uist who died in 1992, Donald John MacDonald, or Donlí Ngunachi, as he was known in Gaelic, we see that traditional A-B rhyme scheme at the end. So looking at that first verse there, we can see that there are 2 short A's in line 1 and 3, and then 2 long A's in line and 4. You've got the word sa, and then arste at the end in line 2 and 4. Sa-an, agus arste. So you've got that end rhyme, which is A-B, A-B. But we also have wonderful examples of internal rhyme here. So I've lost the place here. Where were we? Yes. Yeah, so the internal rhyme. In verse 3, and it's easier to see in verse 3, beginning with that verse there. We see how the vowels in the last word in line 1, so you've got jalichtje there, jalichtje, are taken up in syllables 3, 4, and 5 in the second line, jalicha, jalichtje, jalicha. So it's a very, very tight rhyme, and that's called eichgel in Gaelic, internal rhyme, which goes from one line into the middle of the next line. But not only that, we see how those vowels are repeated later in that same line as well. Syllables 6, 7, 8, we've got mialog on. So you've got Gaelicha going with, in the first line, going with Gaelich a in the second line, but Gaelicha goes with mialog a in that second line as well. So there's not much room for manoeuvre with internal rhyme in poetry. That latter example is called Ohanye, which is number 3 there on the screen, internal rhyme. That's the first example of internal rhyme where the same syllables, the same vowels are repeated on the same line. But they can also find the repetition on the following line as well. So we've got independent examples of in the third line of every verse here. So if you look at the word al, which is, the first verse, you've got the third line, Lachale al asnav santanaloch, you've got that. And then the second verse, the third line again, Duskug ur, and then down at the bottom, the third verse with the third line, Ban agul wethuv gatjanachug. So he was very skilled as a poet, being able to write poetry like this that sounds natural to our ear, but has a very, very strict end rhyme and internal rhyme. The Dalziel MacDonald was descended from bardic families too, and he grew up with poetry almost as a fireside language. He imbibed that traditional bardic meter with his mother's milk, and it was natural for him. His poetry flowed. There's a whole book of his poetry. Given that Gaelic culture was very much based on oral tradition, these strict metrical patterns enabled people to remember screeds of poetry, because the mind becomes accustomed to seeking vowel sounds in particular places, and then you're anticipating or remembering the words that would then follow. And sadly, it's a dying art. We've even free verse in Gaelic these days, believe it or not. Yes, we're that modern. But as song is very important in our culture, only traditional poetry can be sung, and therefore it's still highly prized and valued in our community. The next example is a very popular hymn written by the same bard, by Dalziel MacDonald. In Gaelic culture, there's much intertwining of the sacred and the secular. Now, this is a picture of our church in Eriskay, the church where I live next to this church, St. Michael's up on the hill there, Crochnaskra. And in the church, the altar rests on the prow of a lifeboat, which came ashore in the Pullachar, the South Uist. And it was a lifeboat from the HMS Hermes, an aircraft carrier. So that was taken, and it was the only part of the lifeboat that could be rescued. And it was made into the foundation of the new altar when the altar was put in place there. But there are other maritime symbols throughout the church as well. We have the sanctuary lamp, which you can just about make out on the pillar here. It's actually a ship's lamp. We also have proper ones held by the angels behind there on the windows. And then we have stars in the apse of the sanctuary as well. And the anchors under the altar you can see on the prow of the lifeboat there. So the working life of the island is brought right into the church, right into the sanctuary of the church. Similarly, our fishermen, because it's a fishing community, would always go to sea with holy water in the boat and bless candles aboard their boat. And they always slept with a rosary under their pillow at night time when they were able to. Every summer we still celebrate the annual Fisherman's Mass, followed by the blessing of boats, and a bottle of holy water is given to each vessel that is blessed. So it's a perfect expression of the incarnation that we believe in as Christians, and also the value of the hidden years of Jesus in Nazareth, that work and worship are so intimately bound together. But let's go back to this hymn by the bard Dalziel. It's a hymn that takes up the imagery of the natural world all around us, and it applies it to Christ. The idea in the poet's mind being that creation leads us back to the Creator. So the colours again show the skill of the poet in putting this piece together, the end rhyme, the internal rhyme, and there isn't rhyme between the lines here. It's simply the internal rhyme on each line and then the end rhyme. But there's not a syllable out of place there in what he's written. So I'll not pick out all the rhymes, but I'll translate a couple of verses of this hymn just to give you a feel for it, so you can experience what the poet was trying to say. So verse 2 says, he says, you, in reference to Christ, are our fragrant breeze. You are our morning dew of May, our safe harbour in times of storm, our fishing grounds, our food, our fullness are you. In your nets may we be when death comes upon us. And then verse 4, which begins, it It reads, "Death is not an end for us, but a new growth for us. O fill us with your grace, be ever near to us. And when the moment comes upon us at the end of our time, the young month of May will be in the place of December." Now, I think to non-Celtic ears that might sound quite pagan. We're not quite in Wickerman territory there, but it's imagery that we're not maybe used to in the English language. But for Gaels, it's very natural, taking the imagery of the world around us and referring it back to Christ. The melodies for many of these hymns were written by Ishmael T. MacDonald, a Uist composer who lives in Glasgow, but she's from a very musical family. And her melodies are both spiritual and Gaelic. We don't have the ditties that we sometimes find in English. She's combined the best of both traditions, and I'm happy to say that she's still composing and writing melodies for some of the hymns that I've translated. So let's go to one of those hymns now to show how this ancient tradition, elevated and refined in the late 20th century by Dol Ian Honachie and Ishmael T, continues today in the 21st century. So a first example is the 11th century Lenten hymn Ex More Docte Mystico. In the Gaelic translation, there's end rhyme, as you can see, A, all the way through. But there's also internal rhyme, as we had in that last example, where you've got on the fifth and eighth line, fifth and eighth syllable of every line, you've got the same vowel. Trask, Catif, La, Mar, Asoch, Payan, Chalgain, and then Chiarna, Agus, Rius. So you can see how that works there. And I'm not going to sing it for you, you'll be pleased to know. We have another example here, Rex Aeterne Domine. Where are we here? Yeah, okay. So this is a 6th century Easter hymn in Latin, Rex Aeterne Domine. And the end rhyme is a bit more complicated, A, B, C, D, all the way through. So we have 8 lines here in each verse. So the last 2 syllables of every odd line rhyme with the second and third syllables in every even line. So you have Shiari in the first line, and it goes with Yin Vach in the second line. You have Iavai in the third line, and Hiet in the fourth line there. Shachran and Vialter, Nater and Gal. So we've got a different type of internal rhyme here, where it's going from the odd lines to the even lines. But still, it's a form of classical bardic meter that is very valid, and it's lovely to be able to produce hymns in this form. So in all these cases, what I've tried to do is to take ancient hymns from the wider Catholic tradition that have nothing to do with the Celtic world. They belong to the universal church. But to take that tradition that is ours nevertheless and clothe them in Gaelic bardic meter. The truths expressed here are the same as in the Latin version, so no heresy, I'm pleased to say. I don't think anyway. But the language and the melodies are thoroughly Celtic. It's an expression of the incarnation. So a final example which shows how the work and worship culture are intertwined is a hymn that I composed for Easter. Now, Father Allen, my predecessor and a great hero of mine, the great Gaelic scholar and bard, he wrote a Christmas hymn based on what we call a walking song. That's walking with a U as opposed to without a U. We're not walking as in going for a little stroll. Walking is when women worked the cloth. It's a song which accompanied women when they were at work so as to keep up a rhythm as they beat the cloth to try and stretch it and prepare it for using to make clothes. So I wanted to compose a song just like he did, but for the other pole of the liturgical year for Eastertide. So I took Matthew 28 as my text and prepared a poetic rendering of that chapter, which runs to 30 verses, as it turns out. And walking songs tend to be long anyway, because there's a lot of work to be done and the women had to keep up that rhythm. So walking songs are composed of very short verses, sung by a solo woman, with refrains taken up by all the others. And as the holy women were the first to witness the empty tomb and become apostles to the apostles themselves, I thought it would be appropriate to recount the Easter story using a form of song traditionally associated with women. Now, the meter here is extremely strict. Each verse consists of 2 lines of 8 syllables and 6 syllables, so 8 in the first line, 6 on the second line. In line 1, syllables 1, 5, and 7 have to have the same vowel. And in line 2, you can see there that 1 and 2 rhyme with 5 and 6, but the third syllable has to refer back to the rhyme scheme on the first line. So we have, for instance, there in that first verse, Tra, Sevating, La, Nakashka, 3 long A's, and then Dorocha and Doing go together, but Va refers back to the long A on the first line. And then perhaps an easier one to look at is verse 3, where you've got gushgat as in suain le uavas, you've got the u sound, and then hes iat and ekal go together, but suas refers back to the rhyme scheme on the first line there as well. So the chorus, as you can see there, that's on the far side where there's red highlighting there. Nefiath means the men. What we did with the chorus so that the whole congregation should join in would be, the verses would be sung by a woman from the choir loft, and then the men would sing the first line, the women would sing the second line of the chorus, and then everyone joins together. So the whole thing is building up in strength to celebrate the resurrection. And the translation of the chorus is, Christ arose from the grave, victorious Saviour of the people, Christ arose from the grave. It sounds better in Gaelic than it does in English. And if there's time at the end, I might teach you that chorus and we might attempt to sing it just to see what we can make of it. So it's only ever been sung in Dalabra so far in South Uist. So if it gets a premiere in Oxford as well, then all the better. We'll move on. So such is the work that's been entrusted to me as an island priest, as an heir to a tradition of faith and culture that's precious to me, and which I'm determined to contribute to and then pass on to the next generation. I can't speak of Eriskay, my home, without mentioning that great Gaelic scholar here, Father Alan MacDonald. He was aged only 45 when he died, just about 46. And he left a great body of research into folklore as well as collections of local vocabulary and his poems and his hymns. Now, I don't put myself in the same category as Father Alan, but his work inspires me over a century later to be involved in preserving our bardic tradition and making it incarnate again in our own times. Every year, Gaelic learners and doctoral students make their way to Eriskay and come to the church to learn about our traditions in their native context. And it was the same in Father Alan's day as well. Researchers into the second sight and folklore would come and spend time with the island priest who, although he came from mainland Lochaber and had learned Gaelic as a second language, had become a tradition bearer for the cultural heritage of the community he served as a priest. He enculturated himself as well. So the church played an important role in preserving that cultural heritage. And among the folklore researchers was my own relation, Dr. George Henderson, who became a firm friend of Father Alan long before ecumenism was fashionable. Another visitor to Father Alan, this time on the trail of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites, was Henry Jenner, that you see there. And he's known to us as the father of the Cornish language revival. He stayed in the very house that I now live in, next to St. Michael's Church, while he was following up the Jacobite history of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Years later, before Jenner died, he converted to Catholicism. And I often wonder how much of an influence his visit to Father Alan had in that decision. And perhaps research into his correspondence in the archives of Crescent Kernow and Redruth will provide an answer when I've got the time to go down there and undertake that research. Fittingly, Jenner died on the vigil of the feast of the apparition of St. Michael, patron saint of the Celtic peoples. No better day to die for a Celt. A few years ago, during lockdown, before I learned of Jenner's visit to Eriskay, I took up the study of the Cornish language just because I was bored. I thought, during lockdown, there's not much else to do, so why not go online and learn a new language? But also because I've got roots in Cornwall too. And I was teaching Gaelic online at the time and wondered what it'd be like to learn a new language online. I've never taught except face-to-face. So I thought, well, I'll go online as a student to see how that feels. I only intended to study Cornish for a year, but I fell in love with the language and then passed my final exams with the Academy Kernowick last summer. So I'm now employed, apart from Gaelic, in helping with the proofreading of the Cornish Bible and liturgical work with the ecumenical group in the Anglican Diocese of Truro. Now, as a revived language, there's a certain amount of positivity in the Cornish community because it's all about new birth and growth. There's no native-speaking community to maintain, and that's the problem for us in the Gaelic community. Yes, we see growth as learners come to the language, but we struggle to support an ever-shrinking community of native speakers, which Cornish, of course, doesn't have. Perhaps William Painter, our friend from Exeter College, would have known some of the last generation of Cornish speakers in his native Penwith. I'm happy to be part of the revival of something that he probably thought to be thoroughly moribund in his own day. So I hope that that part of the talk has given you an insight into the language, culture and faith of our little island in the Hebrides, a last refuge of the once great Celtic culture that swept through the whole of continental Europe, from the Galatia of St. Paul to the Gaeltachts of our own time in Scotland and Ireland. And that brings me neatly to my conclusion. What's the relevance of any of this to you as modern-day Catholics who are not Gaels, who are living well outside the village des irréductibles Gaulois that I live in. Well, taking a long view of Christian history, we know that there have been periods of growth and decline in different places in different centuries. In periods of decline, the Church always acted as a guardian of Christian culture, keeping that flame burning until the fire of faith could spread again. Christianity, unlike other religions, has always been able to take what is good in other cultures and refine it or elevate it by marrying it with the faith. Just as Christ, by taking our flesh, redeemed us, so when the faith is properly enculturated, it redeems that culture too. Here in the West, our culture has been shaped for centuries under the influence of the Christian faith, and not just my culture as a Gael. We're seeing a movement among the younger generation now hungry for an identity that's rooted in something greater than the present moment. A generation asking who they are and where they've come from. Coas a hashiv, as we'd say in Gaelic, who are you from? Some of the great thinkers of our time, even atheist and agnostic ones, are open in their praise of Christian culture and all that it has bequeathed to us today. But for us as believers, that's not enough. Faith should not be reduced to being merely an element of our cultural identity. Faith is about a living relationship with God. But let's not underestimate the value of our involvement in the cultural life of the society in which we live as a means of bringing people through culture to the threshold of a living faith. Culture, then, is a means of evangelization because the gospel is already hidden in our culture. In 2021, for the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St. Columba, I produced that novena. You can see a picture there in the actual books there. And it was through the Catholic Truth Society that the novena was published. So this new novena to St. Columba, which begins in fact on the 31st for his feast day on the 9th of June, is in English, Gaelic and in Irish. And it includes a litany to the saint using titles gleaned from ancient sources which mention St. Columba. In the introduction to the book, I wrote about how it was important for us to rediscover our cultural and spiritual roots. For without roots, the plant cannot be nourished and must surely wither and die. In the introduction to the novena, in the book here, I also quoted from the apostolic exhortation of St. John Paul II, Ecclesia in Europa. He wrote that in 2003, and I want to leave the last words tonight to him because he expresses what I'm trying to say far more succinctly than I could hope to do myself. So he wrote, Europe needs to make a qualitative leap in becoming conscious of its spiritual heritage. Taking up anew this invitation to hope, I repeat to you again today, Europe, as you stand at the beginning of the third millennium, open the doors to Christ. Be yourself, he says. Rediscover your origins. Relive your roots. Down the centuries, you've received the treasure of Christian faith. It has grounded your life as a society on principles drawn from the gospel, and traces of this are evident in the art, literature, thought, and culture of your nations. But this heritage does not just belong to the past. It is a project in the making, to be passed on to future generations, for it has indelibly marked the life of the individuals and people who together have forged the continent of Europe. End of quote. Faith and culture are linked as the soul is to the body. We should never underestimate the importance of being involved as Christians in preserving and developing and transmitting our cultural heritage. It's a means of evangelization. Every summer when our local college in Uist hosts its annual Gaelic summer school, the week always begins with the parish mass in Gaelic, and most people who come are not Catholic, but they're told to come to mass anyway. Almost every summer, I meet returning students who tell me that they've converted to the Catholic faith or are in the process of being converted because they encountered the Catholic faith through our Gaelic culture. In my work for 2 linguistic minority groups, I never lose hope, and it would be easy to do so when you look at our situations. At the heart of our faith is the wonderful truth of the resurrection. I don't know what future generations will make of my contribution to the worlds of Gaelic and Cornish liturgy, but I do know that they will only be able to make a judgment because I've done something rather than nothing. For my part, I'll be happy that I shall have passed on what I myself received. So as we say in Gaelic, tapaleisha, thank you very much. Beras de hui in Cornish. If you're interested in that, Gaelic's easier, as you can see. So if you want to learn any language, speak to me afterwards. Tapaleisha, thank you very much.
Excellent. If there's no more questions, would you like to give a shot teaching
Okay.
us this?
Okay, walking songs. We'll see how this goes. I'll teach you the pronunciation first. That's the most important thing. So we'll say it, and then I'll teach you the melody. The melody is very simple. We've got a gender imbalance here, though, I'm afraid. We've got 3 ladies, is that correct? If some of the men, if we've got any tenors here, you can be a lady for tonight. I give you permission, okay, to be a different gender just for 5 minutes. And then you change back. I'm not sure what the technical term for that is, but anyway, let's not bother. So, first line, Yerich Kriasta. So, Yerich Kriasta. Say that. Suas von Uai. So put that together. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. So Christ arose from the grave. The verb comes first in Gaelic for our linguists. VSO, verb, subject, object. Second line. So this is where the women have to work a wee bit harder because you've got 2 lines to learn. The men only 1. Okay. Slanjar buach, mór and tlúai. Mór and tlúai. So slanjar buach, mór and tlúai. Slanjar buach, mór and tlúai. And then everyone joins in with Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Good, okay, that sounds quite convincing. I mean, Xavier is already an honorary Gael because he's never away from the islands, summer after summer. So if you do really well, we'll give you honorary citizenship, freedom of the Isles. So the melody for the Yerich Kriasta is the same in both instances, but the women have a different bit. So the melody sounds like this. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Again. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. And the women sing this. Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Okay, so it will be a wee bit faster. The women, when they walk the cloth, would be thumping the table with the cloth, and then you thump it a couple of times and pass it on for the next bit, and that's how we kept the rhythm up. So a walking song is always to a certain rhythm. So if you've got a bit of chair or table near you, let's go. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Again. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Okay, so I'll do the verses. I've got 6 verses here that'll do. And by the end of it, you'll know this off by heart. You'll be thinking about this in your sleep tonight, okay? I have to stand for this. I can't sing when I'm seated. So get the rhythm going. We wouldn't be doing this in church, by the way. We don't actually beat the pews, but because they all know what a walking song is, but we just use the... So I'll maybe get you to stop the beating after the 3rd verse, so you can just actually hear the hymn as it would be sung back home. So start the rhythm. Trase wat in mane kaske doorgevaand hoing. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Vane seitjaren en katel soin for skalne hoog. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Rushkatas en soin le hovas hesat suas le hekel. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Hanik nahen lanen lawen spistri en do hiesa. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Vanalaya paskshan anarshkan the marav gahungag. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjar buach mór and tlúai. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai. Hanik einjalas na flahas gloashe chlachsen huashin. Yerich Kriasta Suas von Uai, Slanjat boch mor en ploy, Jeri Christus suas von noi. Well done. Excellent. So the story, actually, just to give you the quick translation of this, so it says, early in the morning on the day of Easter, dark was the world, and then they sing the chorus, Christ arose from the grave, victorious Saviour of the people, Christ arose from the grave. The soldiers were sleeping in sound sleep under the shade of the grave, and then they woke out of their slumber with terror. They stood up with fear. And then women came, their hands full of spices for Jesus. He who was lying, how do you say in English? He was lying enfolded in the linens, who had not yet been anointed, anointed. And then an angel came from glory, and he moved the stone at that moment. So it's telling the Easter story in poetic form, a story we're all familiar with, but setting it in the context of this walking song, which you performed admirably. Well done. Give yourselves a round of applause.